She can go back to YouTube for the first one for you. For the first part.
Oh yeah. So I'm going to start on page, I think we were going to get to, so we were going to get to multiple representation. I pointed everybody into the direction of doing that multiple representation. And I think right to cure training that I had done, that we had done a few months ago now. But we've got the time and I'll just go ahead and start there.
Okay.
So, and are you, well, let's talk about this. Have you been writing offers and doing buyer agency agreements?
I have never personally did it before by myself. Wait 1 second. This is a computer. Go ahead and log in, but I wanted to talk to you. So I'll talk to you just a little bit. Okay. I know you did it on a computer, but it'll be good to just log in, but I know you don't want to do it, dear, but it's good that you do it on a computer. Okay. I'll talk to you. Okay. Okay. I know you're super quiet. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm a motivator too.
Oh,
Okay.
awesome. I need you in my life.
Yeah. Motivator. She really don't want to go on that computer. I'm a property manager too, but they always say motivate the youth. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So this concept, so beginning on page 2, it needs to be spelled out, all of the duties that brokerage owes to a customer and to a client in a transaction. So, first up, all duties that we owe to customers, which is, anyone in, anyone who is working in a real estate transactions is owed these duties. So the duty to provide brokerage services to you fairly and honestly, duty to exercise reasonable skill and care, duty to provide accurate information, duty to protect your confidentiality, safeguard trust funds, and then presenting contract proposals in an objective manner. So those are duties that all parties are owed in a transaction. Additional duties, which I think I did go over this last time, but we'll keep going. We are able at their request to provide information and advice on real estate matters, provide all material adverse facts and as well as material facts, the duty to negotiate on behalf of the client. So all reasons why they're entering into a relationship with us to begin with. Not placing our interests ahead of theirs. So these are all pieces that I go over with a client. I'm not going over this line by line. Here's another agent, great. But now we'll get into multiple representation and designated agency. So a multiple representation relationship, again, exists if we, as Keller Williams, has a seller client, and the other party, the other buyer on the other side of the transaction is a buyer client of another Keller Williams agent. So someone who has a buyer agency relationship with their buyer's agent. Where this comes into play, or where this might become a conflict of interest, is for those smaller brokerages that could be just like a one-man show, and it could be a conflict of interest for that agent to be trying to represent both sides in the same capacity. So the reason why I say that is because a lot of clients might be confused as to why we're even going over this, because it's very common that a Keller Williams agent might be the agent bringing another buyer client to the transaction, right? And that's what our goal is. Our hope is that happens. So I always like to just kind of, maybe not necessarily over explain, but just say, this kind of seems counterintuitive. We hope that a Keller Williams agent brings the other buyer, but this is just more for those smaller brokerages where it might be a conflict of interest. And so we need to have all parties consent to this idea. So I'll just read through. A multiple representation relationship exists if a firm has an agency agreement with more than one client who is a party in the same transaction. Client is the key word here. So again, that buyer on the other side also has to have a contractual relationship with Keller Williams. If they're acting as a seller's agent and they are a customer of Keller Williams, then this does not even apply. So if you and the firm's other clients in the transaction consent, again, the keyword consent, the firm may provide services through designated agency, which is one type of multiple representation relationship. And this is what our end goal is with this. We want all parties in the transaction to consent to designated agency. So the three types of multiple representation relationships are designated agency, without designated agency, and a complete rejection of multiple representation altogether. So designated agency means that different agents with the firm will negotiate on behalf of you and the other client or clients in the transaction, and the firm's duty to you as a client will remain the same. So using Joni and I as an example, if I have a seller, they're a client in the transaction. Joni, as the buyer's agent, brings a buyer to the transaction. She can negotiate, give advice, and give the full scope of brokerage services to her buyer client, as I am able to give to my seller client. So if you think of a boxing ring, and we always like to use this analogy, if you think of a boxing ring, we've got seller in one corner, buyer in the other corner, and then Joni and I in the middle, boxing out. And having the ability, the key here is having the ability to provide full brokerage services. So the right to negotiate, the duty to give, or the ability to give advice, all reasons why a buyer or seller are hiring us to begin with. So without designated agency is another type of multiple representation relationship. Same scenario. Joni has the buyer client, I have the seller client, but let's say neither party consents to designated agency. So now Joni and I have lost our ability to provide that full scope of brokerage services. We do no longer have the ability to negotiate or give advice to either side. So we're acting essentially as neutral parties in this transaction, which does not do any good for neither client, for either client. So that when we're, presenting these choices to them, I mean, they need to understand this is what you would lose if you did not consent to designated agency. That all being said, I'm going to read it as well. So if a designated agency relationship is not authorized, the clients in the transaction may still authorize or reject a different type of multiple representation relationship in which, hold on. Oh, no, here we go. In which the firm may provide brokerage services to more than one client in a transaction, but neither the firm nor any of the agents may assist any client with information, opinions, and advice, and spelled out right in there, which may favor the interests of one client over the other clients. Under this neutral approach, the same agent may represent more than one client in a transaction. So this is where we would say that it's most common that we see without designated agency being chosen as the option here, is if the same agent, so I'm going to use myself as an example. If I have a seller client and a buyer approaches me, and I might already have a buyer client relationship, and I just happen to list a property that they're interested in, it could be the case where I could write the offer for both sides as a buyer client, working for my seller client, but I remain neutral in the transaction, and I'm essentially acting as like a paper pusher between the two of them. But sometimes that can work out just fine if all parties come to terms relatively easily.
Or you can ask the buyer to be a customer.
Or you can ask the buyer to be a customer as well. So which we're not going to get into, I'm not going to dive too deep into all of that. But under that training that we do talk about that much more in depth. So, but when going over the, practically speaking, when going over the contract with a seller client, you know, it's presenting it. So this scenario might come up in the state of Wisconsin. We have to get consent from all parties for this. This is how this works. This only applies if this certain type of buyer client writes on your property. So another way to present it is if they choose multiple representation with designated agency, they are opening themselves up to the full buyer pool of people who can write on this property. If they reject it altogether, they have rejected any Keller Williams buyer client, which is a detriment to them. We want as many people being able to write on the property as possible. So on lines 113 through 119 is where they're going to make that decision. And I already have the top one marked here. So if you're explaining it well, there should be no problem for a client to consent to designated agency. In fact, we want another Keller Williams agent to write on the property. All right, any questions about that? It's confusing. Seasoned agents get confused by it. It's just a weird concept because it might not even apply in the transaction at all. So it's, you know, when I know that I used to fumble through it, like this may or may not happen. If it does, you know, so always ask questions about it. You know, if you're coming along to a transaction and if you have questions, just please come to us. Then just a note under that. So starting at line 120, all clients who are parties to this agency agreement consent to the selection checked above. So that's also key. So if we've got a seller client consenting to multiple representation with designated agency, that buyer client on the other side also has to consent to that. You may modify the selection by written notice to the firm at any time. So these can all be changed. So if you come across a situation where you need to change it, you absolutely can. Your firm is required to disclose to you in your agency agreement the commission or fees that you may owe to your firm. If you have any questions about the commission or fees that you may owe based upon the type of agency relationship you select with your firm, you should ask your firm before signing the agency agreement. In our cases, like I've never seen a commission change based off of how that choice is given. So sub-agency, so your firm with your authorization in the agency agreement, it may engage other firms. So we're able to engage with Coldwell Banker, other co-broke companies to be able to bring a buyer to the transaction. A note for the seller beginning at line 130. Please review this information carefully. An agent can answer your questions about brokerage services, but if you need legal advice, so another checkpoint to say that we're not attorneys is here. So if you need legal advice, tax advice, or professional home inspection, contact an attorney, tax advisor, or home inspector. There's lots of checkpoints for us to say that we are not attorneys. Take the opportunity to state that explicitly. And by the way, for anyone who was not on team meeting last week, Tuesday, Joni did go over, you know, our as compliance brokers, what our full services to you guys are. And we're not attorneys. And we need to make sure that our clients understand our limitations with the contracts. So that's a good one to review. All right, so confidentiality notice to clients. So the firm and its agents will keep confidential any information given to the firm or its agents in confidence, or any information obtained by the firm and its agents that a reasonable person would want to be kept confidential. I always do highlight this. So the following information must be disclosed by law. So beginning on 141 and 142, any material adverse facts must be disclosed, or any facts known by the firm and its agents that contradict the information included in a written inspection report. So that's just a communication from us to the seller saying, we keep your information confidential, but we do by law have the, we're forced to give any, disclose any material adverse facts. So if there's anything that you want to be kept confidential that is a material adverse fact, by law, we still have to go through and disclose that. If there's any confidential information that the seller wants to make sure that we are keeping confidential, they can be explicit with that on line 147. I'll say, I think it's very rare that we see anything written in those lines. If it's confidential, they just won't tell us. Beginning on line 151, so these are provisions for the seller. So parties agree that the firm and its agents will work and cooperate with the firm and its agents in marketing the property. So Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you have to let us do our jobs, including firms acting as subagents. Cooperation includes providing access to the property for showing purposes and presenting offers and other proposals from these firms to the seller. So seller cannot impede on our ability to do that. Let's see here. Limiting the firm's caution. This is the caution for the seller. Limiting the firm's cooperation with other firms may reduce the marketability of the property. So exclusions. So this applies when, actually, I'm gonna take that back. Or start over. So this applies for any any individuals who may have expressed interest in our seller's property prior to us engaging a relationship or forming a relationship with them. So the biggest example of this, I would say, well, first let me read it and then we'll go through examples. So all persons who may acquire an interest in the property who are protected buyers under a prior listing contract are excluded from this listing to the extent of the prior firm's legal rights, unless otherwise agreed to in writing. Within 7 days of this listing, the seller agrees to deliver to the firm a written list of all such protected buyers. So if we took over this listing from another firm, it was listed with another firm, the listing expired, there may be what's called a protected buyer list, meaning that anybody who saw the home during the time that it was previously listed, or anybody who wrote an offer on the home, now becomes what's called a protected buyer. And if that protected buyer returns and writes an offer and gets an accepted offer on the home, that commission that would have been earned and given to us would need to go to that previous brokerage because they earned it. That seller, that buyer, excuse me, saw the home under that previous relationship, under that previous listing. And it happens more often than you would think that protected buyers will come back, circle back around. And it's argued that it was the marketing efforts of that first listing agreement, that first companies, that really secured that buyer. So that is why they are protected. They are protected for a year. It is
From the end of the
a year from the end of the expiration of that contract. So if I had a 3-month contract and it expired yesterday, beginning day one is today, for the next year, they are protected under that provision in the listing contract. Another point about this is if you do have a listing that expires, you need to get that, promptly deliver that protected buyer list to the seller. It's no later than 3 business days. Actually, I need to re-review that. We'll get to that. It might be 72 hours. It might not be calendar days, not business days. But you as a listing agent, first thing you're going to do is collect all those names of the people who saw it Get the names of the people who wrote an offer on it, of course. And we've got templates for these protected buyer letters. And, the last time that we had talked about protected buyer letters, so maybe tomorrow would be good to talk about this stuff. There's a lot more expired listings now.
That's what I said.
Yeah. So, this might be more common now, now that the market has been shifting. So, again, as a listing firm, we need to get those names collected together and deliver a letter to the seller by mail, and then follow up with an email as well. Joni and I do need to sign those letters as well, but we want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves. And if that
It's
buyer, very important, if that
Mhm.
buyer comes around and writes an offer under a new relationship with another brokerage, we want to be able to get that commission. We have a case right now where we were not the previous brokerage, but we took over listing. Previous brokerage did not send a protected buyer letter. And we know that a protected buyer might be, or a potential protected buyer, somebody who saw it under that previous relationship, is probably going to be writing an offer, and we're going to get the commission because the listing firm did not deliver that letter in a timely manner. So really important. All right, so that is one exclusion to this listing contract, if such a case exists. But then also we can name other parties who might be an exclusion, or an exclusion to this listing contract. So beginning at line 163, the following other buyers, and then you can individually name them here, are excluded from this listing until, and then you can put a date in here. These other buyers are no longer excluded from this listing after the specified date, unless on or before this specified date, seller has either accepted a written offer from the buyer or sold the property to the buyer. So this is where I was kind of getting into this example before. I think a good example of this is, I'm going to sell my house, and my neighbor has told me that they have a friend who might want to see it or might want to purchase it. Or they have a family member who they want to move in right next door to them. So we've verbally had discussions about them potentially writing an offer. They could become an excluded buyer here, meaning that seller will not owe us a commission if that particular person writes an offer on the property. We like to keep this timeline short. So, yes, we as a listing firm agree to name them as an excluded buyer, but we're only going to do that for the first 2 weeks of the listing. If they don't make that decision within that first 2 weeks, and then they decide to, it could be argued that it was our marketing efforts that prompted them to make that offer. So talk to us if you have a situation like that, but just kind of keep in mind that if there is an excluded buyer that the seller brings forward, that we want to keep that timeline short to protect us and protect you and your time and your money. Okay, any questions about that so far? Anything to add?
No, but
Okay.
I think it's a good topic for the meeting tomorrow.
Okay, glad we're going through this, guys. All right, on page 4, it gets into definitions that you'll find in a transaction in the listing contract. So I'm not going to go through every single one, but we've got adverse fact here, deadlines, what a defect is, the definition of a firm, defining what a fixture is. So these are all good for, if you have a question about what should be included or excluded in an offer, just refer back to the definition of a fixture, or sorry, included in or excluded in the listing or in the home. Then here's a caution actually about fixtures. Exclude any fixtures to be retained by seller or which are rented. So, you know, as you're going through your listing, on your listing appointments, as you're going through the home, if you notice that there's a water softener, make sure that you're asking the question, do you own that outright, Mr. Seller, or do you rent it? If it's rented, we have to make sure that we're putting that in as an exclusion, for example. And I also like to caution people on fixtures, because this is definitely a final walkthrough, potential final walkthrough dispute. So we want to make sure that we're clear about what the seller intends on keeping and what they intend on leaving. I like this example because we just had a case once where we had a home that had a bar in the basement that looked, I mean, it went with the room. It should have stayed with the room. It was like, it completed the room as it was sold. I mean, it was sold as a bar, like hangout area. Buyer went to go do their final walkthrough, and the bar was taken away because it was technically a loose piece. It wasn't affixed to the wall or affixed to the floor. But it was clear that it should have been something that would have stayed in the home. So there was, of course, a argument about it. I wish I remembered what happened. I think that we ended up having to buy it from the seller to make sure that the seller would keep it there, which, yeah.
Sometimes the agent is asked to purchase.
Yeah,
It is.
just to keep things kosher. So, but yeah, just make sure you're asking those questions. Another one that I think is a big one is bathroom mirrors that look like they should be affixed to the wall and they go with the decor and like the flow of the room, but then they're actually just, you know, hung on a nail, which, you know, makes it personal property. So that's another thing to kind of take note as you're going and walking through a home. Property is
Oh, it's
defined
got
here.
up here, the material adverse fact.
Oh,
So it's a distinction between adverse fact and material.
Okay, so yes, material adverse fact means an adverse fact that a party indicates is of such significance or that is generally recognized by licensee as being of such significance to a reasonable party that it would affect the party's decision to enter into the contract to begin with. So if we know those things ahead of time, they need to be disclosed. Protected buyer, so that going back to the exclusions provision in the listing contract, it goes on to define what a protected buyer is. So it means a buyer who personally or through any person acting on behalf of the buyer during the term of the listing delivers to seller or the firm or its agents an offer to purchase, views the property, attends an individual showing of the property, or communicates with agents, cooperating firms regarding any potential terms. So it just further defines what a protected buyer is. Extension of listing is kind of the third piece of all of this. So this defines for the seller that this listing term is extended for that year to that protected buyer. So upon receipt of a written request from a seller or a firm that has listed the property, the firm agrees to promptly deliver to seller a written list of those buyers known by the firm and its agents to whom the extension period applies. Should this listing be terminated by seller prior to expiration of the term stated in the listing, so whatever's named on the last page, this listing shall be extended for protected buyers on the same terms for 1 year after the listing is terminated. So meaning if I've got a listing right now that expires in December right now, if it expired early, that extension period begins on that earlier date, whatever date it expires. Okay, and then just spelling this all out for the seller. So occupancy, this is a good point to remind the seller gives the buyer occupancy at the time of closing, unless otherwise agreed upon. This is also important, and to have the property in broom swept condition and free of all debris and personal property except for personal property belonging to the current tenants or sold to the buyer or left with the buyer's consent. This is very important. This will head off potential final walkthrough arguments. if you are going through a home and there is just filled with stuff, we need to remind a seller that it needs to be clear of all contents in the basement, the home, the attic. That is definitely a place where people forget things. Garage rafters, just as you're going through, just be mindful, like, okay, Mr. Seller, just a reminder, all of that stuff needs to be gone prior to closing, not prior to listing, but prior to closing. When the buyer takes occupancy, the expectation is that all of this stuff is gone. So definitely, there's so many of us who have cleaned out houses in the final 3 days. So it's not fun. Leased property. So if you guys are listing duplexes, if a property is currently leased and leases, it's just a reminder that leases extend beyond closing. So seller shall assign seller's rights under the leases and transfer all security deposits and prepaid rents thereunder to the buyer at closing. Seller acknowledges that the seller remains liable under the leases unless released by the tenants. Seller should consider obtaining any indemnification agreement from buyer for liabilities under the leases unless released by the tenants. Biggest point here, if I'm selling a duplex and we've got, year leases in place and there's 9 months left on the lease, that new buyer is taking on the new tenant. So tenants are not forced out of their homes because of a transfer of property. Notice about Sex Offender Registry. So this is in the listing contract. I always thought that was odd. But if the seller has any issue, wants to know, I guess if they want to know if there's any sex offenders in the area before they list it, they can go to this website. I definitely am pointing that out to buyers, if they have any concerns about that before they want to write on a home, to consult that website. Real estate condition report. So this, pointing this out to the seller. So seller agrees to complete the real estate condition report provided by the firm to the best of the seller's knowledge. Seller agrees to amend the report should seller learn of any defects after completion of the report, but before acceptance of a buyer's offer to purchase. We went over this in team meeting a couple weeks ago. Seller authorizes the firm and its agents to distribute the report to all interested parties and agents inquiring about the property. So this is consent, authorization from the seller to us to provide this report to potential buyers. Seller acknowledges that the firm and its agents have a duty to disclose all material adverse facts as required by law. Another checkpoint to say that. So if they, if we receive a real estate condition report that is clearly missing a large crack in the foundation block that we saw, we need to go back to that seller and say, I noticed this isn't on the real estate condition report. This is something that I would need to disclose if you're not going to. Very important. Seller representations regarding defects. So another reminder for the seller. Seller represents to the firm that as of the date of this listing, seller has no notice or knowledge of any defects affecting the property other than those noted on the real estate condition report. Warning to the seller: if seller representations are incorrect or incomplete, seller may be liable for damages and costs. So just, Mr. Seller, you want to avoid post-closing disputes of any kind, make sure that you are disclosing. Seller cooperation with marketing efforts. Seller agrees to cooperate with the firm in the firm's marketing efforts and to provide the firm with all records, documents, and other materials in seller's possession that are in connection with the sale. Seller authorizes the firm and its agents to do those acts reasonably necessary to effect a sale, and seller agrees to cooperate fully with these efforts, which may include use of the MLS, internet, advertising, or lockbox system. Seller shall promptly refer all persons making inquiries concerning the property to the firm. So this is important. So if somebody comes directly to the seller and is inquiring about an offer, they need to refer that person to us to make sure that we're talking directly with that person. We don't want a seller to end a listing contract with us early because they might potentially be able to avoid a commission. Open house and showing responsibilities. So a warning to the seller is aware that there's a potential risk of injury, damage, and or theft involving persons attending individual showings. Seller accepts responsibility for preparing the property to minimize likelihood of injury. So, making sure that, walkways are clear, there's no trip hazards, anything that might potentially cause harm to somebody. So dogs, making sure that we've got dogs kenneled if they need to be. Seller agrees to hold the firm and its agents harmless for any losses or liability resulting from personal injury, property damage, or theft. Seller acknowledges that individual showings and open houses may be conducted by licensees other than agents and the firm. I just lost my place with that, and I want to Oh, appraisers and inspectors may conduct appraisals and inspections without being accompanied by the agents of the firm or other licensees, and that buyers or licensees may be present at all inspections and testing and may photograph or videotape property unless otherwise provided for. But also, I use this as the checkpoint to say, make sure that jewelry is locked up, drugs, pharmaceutical drugs are put away, so open houses are going to be happening, individual showings are going to be happening, so we need to, I don't know why this would stop. Okay. Termination of listing. Neither seller nor the firm has a legal right to unilaterally terminate this listing absent a material breach of contract by the other party. Seller understands that the parties to the listing are seller and the firm. Agents for the firm do not have the authority to enter into a mutual agreement to terminate the listing, amend the commission amount, or shorten the term of this listing without written consent of the agent's broker. So Joni or I, seller and the firm agree that the termination of the listing by either party before the date stated on line 312 shall be effected by the seller only if stated in writing. Basically, both parties need to agree to end the listing agreement. So we have never, I don't know a case that we've forced a seller to stay in a contract with us. If you have questions about that, please come to us. Earnest money, this is just, I actually do point this out to sellers. So if earnest money is involved in the transaction, which 9.99 times out of 10 it will be, firm holds trust funds in connection with the transaction, they shall be retained by the firm in the firm's trust account. So I have had sellers who have thought that they just get that earnest money, like a personal check is written directly to them, and that's not the case. So just to remind them that earnest money is held in our trust account and then applied towards the down payment, and they eventually receive it through their proceeds. If the transaction fails to close and the seller requests and receives the earnest money as the total liquidated damages, then upon disbursement to seller, earnest money shall be paid first to reimburse the firm for cash advances made by the firm. I don't go through all of that. Just if there is dispute about earnest money, we'll go through it. All right, delivery of documents and written notices. So this is where we will state the authorized methods of delivery. I don't know, fax, no, obviously, commercial delivery, US mail. It's very rare that these are being checked. It's all email these days. So this, you're going to name the email address for the seller. So that's the personal email address of the seller. Email address for the firm, so that's your email address. And this is the authorized method for us to deliver documents back and forth. Any additional provisions that you might want to name, these lines can be used 303 to 308. The attached addenda, so really the KW disclosure does not need to be named here. I have it there, but if there's any addendum to the listing contract, that's rare. Usually you're seeing that with offer to purchases, of course, but not in listing contracts. Term of the listing contract is, this is the date of the first date of the term of listing contract, not the date that they sign it. So let's say it's very often that we'll post date listing contracts. So and then have that agent or have the seller and agent sign, a couple days before. But this is the first day on line 311. Expiration date is named on line 312. I would say it's typical that our listing contracts are 6 months. And then seller will sign here, date here. There's a seller entity, so a trust, an LLC that can be named there. And then the authorized signature of that seller entity is on line 328. We sign on line 329 and your name will go there, firm, date. And that is the listing contract.
Yep, I want to add something. When Steph was going through all of the definitions and everything, I'll let you in on a secret. How do compliance brokers answer your questions? Well, we go to those pages in the listing contract or in the offer to purchase, and that's where the answers are.
Yes.
So we really just need to carefully read. You as an agent need to really know the contracts before you're explaining it to the client. So you know them to the point where you can understand things about protected buyers or things about what are fixtures and things like that. Because those are the questions that Steph and I get all the time. And the answers are right there in these contracts. So
Yes.
read them carefully.
Yep. Okay, what do you guys have any questions? Thank you for coming. I know it's summertime. I can see other people have felt that it's summertime.
And a pretty day.
So, yeah, I think I just want to end this by stating that go back to that multiple representation training. I think the biggest pieces of the listing contract, we're spending most of our time going through multiple representation. So it needs to be understood well. So
Thank you for coming.
yeah, thank you guys. Have a good day.